So now we can officially start. Well, cool. Well, I'm glad to be here with y'all. I'm excited about the conference, and the theme of it I think is really cool. What's next? Hopefully you're getting some of those questions answered this weekend, and it's been a blessing for you. So not the last session, but the first breakout session, they had specific callings, whatever. How many of y'all were in Autumn's, like Called to the Business World? How many of y'all were in that one? Couple? Okay. How many of y'all were in Yale's, like Called to Ministry? A few? Okay. And the rest of y'all were in one of the other ones? Those are the ones that like you didn't know what you were called to, right? Is that what that was? Oh, there was like a staying home maybe? I don't know. But okay. So we're talking about balancing work and serving the church. And so, I'm kind of looking for those that are maybe called to the business world or bivocational ministry, maybe the most applicable way, setting for this breakout. Let me just tell you who I am a little bit, and then we'll get into it. My name's John, and I am a follower of Jesus, first and foremost. You're like, okay, that's good. I'm a husband of one amazing wife and a father of 4 boys, age 2 to 8. Yeah, all boys. And I told the last group they're half boy, half animal, half ninja, half pure energy. That's how I like to describe them. They just go, and it's nonstop. I also work full-time at UPS. So I'm a manager at UPS. I've worked there for 15 years in a variety of positions. Right now I'm a dispatch manager. So I plan the routes for the brown trucks in 3 counties on the west side of Indianapolis. It's a lot of fun. Hi, come on in. And so I work full-time at UPS, and I'm also an elder at City View Church over on the west side of Avon. And so if you don't know what an elder is, it's just a pastor, right? I'm one of the lay pastors there. Lay meaning they don't pay me anything, right? I do it for free. We have a plurality of elders at City View, and so we have a lead pastor, and then we have 3 elders who support the pastor, and we've got 2 in the pipeline right now. So that's our model of leadership. So I'm one of the elders. I've been doing that for 6 years. And so that's a little bit about me, and it's pertinent, it's relevant to our topic because, when Autumn reached out to me and asked me to lead this particular breakout, I said to my wife, man, this topic is perfect for me, right? Because working a full-time job at UPS and being an elder at my church for the last 6 years has been a delicate and oftentimes a difficult balancing act for me, especially as my family has grown over the last 6 years. And so, as I began to think about this topic, pray about this topic, do some reading and some studying, I came to 2 conclusions. And I want to give this to you up front, okay? First of all, I concluded that I'm really not that good at this, at balancing these things in my life, right? I'm constantly having to learn and relearn these things that we're going to talk about in this breakout. And so just know that I'll be benefiting from this alongside you guys and taking things away from this as much as you, hopefully. And I'm hoping and praying that you'll walk away from this doing what I say and not what I do, right? I don't want you to model after me because this has been a struggle, right? Balancing is hard, especially when you have so many different responsibilities. And so, and the other conclusion I came to was that my wife put Autumn up to this because she thought I needed more balance in my life. And so here I am, teaching myself this topic as I teach it to you. So I'm excited about it. Let me say a quick word of prayer, and then we'll jump into our topic. Father God, we love you. We worship you today, and we just want to give you glory in all that we do. God, I thank you for the people in this room. I thank you for all the attendees of this conference. God, I pray, God, that they would have the ability to hear your voice this weekend, and even now, Lord, that you would speak to them as you use me in my preparations as we look at your word. God, I pray that you would speak to them about priorities and balance and boundaries and all these kinds of important things, Lord, that we struggle with as human beings. And so, God, I just pray that you would give us grace, that you would give us wisdom as we work through this, and that you would just change us, conform us more into the image of your Son so that we can give you glory as we serve the church, as we work our jobs, and in everything that we do. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right. So, I said this in the last group too. I guess I should have asked, but I assumed I would have like the PowerPoint capabilities. So I had this nice PowerPoint to kind of go along with this, so you can see my points and be able to copy them down and that kind of thing. If I'd known I didn't have a PowerPoint, I would have brought you a handout. And so if you missed something and you want me to say something again, feel free to stop me and say, hey, could you say it again so I could, if you're taking notes. So I'm sorry I don't have anything to put in your hands, but here's how we're going to tackle our subject of balancing work and serving the church. I'm going to talk about the importance of work from a biblical perspective, and the importance of serving the church. And then we're going to talk about the importance of balancing the two. You're like, wow, this is a simple math problem, right? 1 + 1 is 2. And then hopefully bring it home by giving you some really practical tips as far as how to balance, do both of these things well, right? And so the first two parts may seem a little unnecessary, may seem a little redundant, a little obvious, because you're hearing this breakout. You want to know how to have a balanced life, right? So you probably already know that both work and serving are important. You want to do both. You want to do both well, but I don't want to assume anything, right? So we're going to go back to some basic stuff. And besides that, the key to balance is having a proper understanding and perspective on the things that we're trying to balance, right? Balance requires the constant maintaining of things as they should be in your life, right? And deviating from that is where we get into problems, right? So an unbalanced or a frustrated ministry leader is one who has gotten one or both of these things out of whack, right? If you think about a scale, right? Like the kind with like 2 plates, one on each side. There's a fulcrum in the middle, and there's a plate on this side, and a plate on this side. And, you add weight to this one, and this one goes like this, right? And then you add weight to that one, and it goes like this. And we're constantly having to balance these things in our life. And if our perspective as to why this is important and why this is important gets out of whack, that's when we get things out of balance, right? So we're going to talk about work from a biblical perspective. We're going to talk about serving from a biblical perspective. And then we'll talk about balancing those things, right? We're going to hit the perspectives first, and then we'll work on the balance, okay? You guys good with that? Okay, good. So let's talk about the importance of work, right? We'll start on one side of the scale and talk about work for a few minutes. So let's start there. Why do we work, right? Why do we work jobs like we do? Not a trick question, all right? Shout it out. Why do we work?
Pay rent.
What?
Pay rent.
To pay?
Rent.
Rent, yes. To pay rent, sorry. I didn't know if I heard you right. Yeah. Why else? Why do we work? Is that it?
To contribute to society.
Okay, very good. Contribute to society, to make money. What else? To survive. That's right. Very, very true. Right? To have something to do, right? Because you're bored. You just feel like going to work. You would do it for free. Very good. Yeah. Hey, you're not wrong, right? So you get bored sitting at home. Okay. Very good. What about from a theological perspective, right? Let's put on our church goggles, right? What are the theological reasons that we work?
Relationships.
Good. That's a good one. Relationships. What else?
I don't think we were wired to do nothing. I think we were wired to have a purpose and do something.
That's very good. Very good. Anybody else?
Be good stewards.
Be good stewards of what?
Of our time.
Okay. Good. I just want to see if you're, on your toes there. Very good. Very good. So I would say 2 things. All right. Those are all good things. 2 reasons, or 2 theological reasons that we work. Okay. 1, we work because God created us to work. And 2, we work because God works. Okay. It is part of our image of God commissioning as human beings. Okay. If we go back to the very beginning, Genesis 1, verse 26. God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps." So God created man in his image. In the image of God he created him, male and female, he created them. And God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish and over the birds and over every living thing that moves on the earth." Right? So here in the creation story, mankind is set apart from the rest of creation, right? Purpose, right? They're set apart from the rest of creation. He gave them a job to do, and he tied it to their image bearer status, because doing the job that God gave them, they would be reflecting his glory, his personality in the world that they were placed in. Okay? And that's true because our God is not a lazy God. Our God is a God who is always at work, and we reflect him. He worked with purpose, and we have purpose, right? That from the very beginning, God was at work. Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God, what? Created, right? In the beginning, God created. The very first picture of God that we have in the Bible is God being active. He's doing something. He's creating. And it wasn't a one-time thing for God. Some, philosophers like to argue that God set the world in motion and stepped back. Jesus tells us thousands of years later in John 5, verse 17, my Father is always at work to this very day, and I too am working. And we are meant to reflect that creative, active nature as His image in the world. This creation account continues into chapter 2. We see these truths being expanded. Okay, listen to this. Prior to God creating man, right? So He created everything else before He created man, obviously before sin, if man wasn't there yet. The Genesis writer raises a tension that existed in the creation regarding the incompleteness of God's creation. Genesis 2:5, we read that it says, there was no man to work the ground. God had created everything that was, and then it said, there was no man to work the ground. In other words, God created humans not only for the purpose of worshiping Him and delighting in Him and having relationship with Him, but He created them to have an important, ongoing contribution to His creation. In Genesis 2:15, we see this come to light. It says, the Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and keep it. See, God takes the initiative. He places man into the garden with a particular task in mind, with a particular job. Now, I want you to check this out, okay? I found this fascinating. And you have to forgive me, all right? I'm a pastor, all right? So get into the weeds a little bit here, but this is cool. In Genesis 2:15, that verse that I just read, where it says, God took the man and put him in the garden to work it. That word for work it is avodah, okay? Avodah. And it's found all over the Hebrew Old Testament. And it's in so many places and so many different contexts, and it has so many different connotations. Okay? In various places, it's translated as cultivate, work, serve, craft. It's even translated as worship. Listen to some of these examples. It's used to describe the backbreaking hard work of God's people making bricks as slaves in Egypt. It's used to describe what the artisans were doing building the tabernacle in Exodus 35. It's used to describe the crafting of linen, of fine linen in 1 Chronicles 4. It's used in the context of Solomon dedicating the temple. Solomon uses the word as he instructs the priests and Levites regarding leading corporate worship. It's the same word. 2 Chronicles 8. So what's the point of that little word study? The point is this, that whether it's making bricks or crafting linen or leading others in worship, the Old Testament writers present an understanding of work that has its root all the way back in Genesis chapter 2, being created in the image of God for a purpose. And, this isn't a theology of work breakout, so we're going to move on in a minute. But suffice it to say that all work that we do, including yours and including mine, has its root all the way back in Genesis chapter 2. The fact that we're made in the image of God is one of the reasons that we work, that we're active, that we do things, right? That we feel uncomfortable if we're doing nothing, right? We need to be doing something. Obviously it works itself out in a variety of ways, and that's why I went through all those examples. So one more important point here, though, and hopefully this is obvious, but for some it's not. Work is not a result of the fall. Okay? Work is not a result of the fall. Now, there have been some who would say that work was not part of God's original design. It was punishment for the sinfulness of man and rejecting God and His sovereign rule over them. Hopefully we've already seen that doesn't line up with God's word, right? God is an active God, and we're made in His image, and so we are called to reflect Him. We're given a role within the creation that we call work. But work, just like everything, was impacted by the fall, right? It was, like everything else. It was impacted by the fall. It became cursed, like everything else, because of the sinfulness of man and our tendency, our now innate desire to make much of ourselves and make less of God, right? The fall brought a curse upon work, right? If you were to read in Genesis 3, God's pronouncement of punishment against man, he said, because you have listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten of the tree of which I commanded you not to eat, cursed is the ground because of you. In pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring for you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. Because of the sin of man, because of the fall, because of the curse brought upon all things in creation, work is now often a source of pain and frustration. It's often disillusioned and distorted. It's used by the enemy to encourage all kinds of evil, right? Enmity and envy and strife and frustration, slothfulness and workaholics, ladder climbing and corner cutting, and all these things, right? Work has been cursed by the fall, and we often lose sight of the purpose of work that God intended. So thank God for Jesus, right? Thank God for Jesus and for the gospel, which redeems work just like it redeems all things in our lives, right? When we surrender to Jesus, we allow him to reorder our lives. What is he doing? He's restoring the image of God in us, right? He's reorienting us back to the original design. And as he sanctifies us, we can recover the true purpose of work in its proper place in our life. Okay, so let me summarize all that, all right? Let me summarize from those verses the points that I'm trying to get across here. God's design, or God's intention for work, is that work was meant to be done for the glory of God, as all things are. But work was meant to be a reflection of who God is, and work was meant to be a stewardship of the creation. I think somebody over there said stewardship. Was that you? Meant to be a stewardship of the creation. Yeah, points for you. Very good. And then you could also say work is meant to be an act of worship, right? Worship should be the motivation for everything that we do. As we work, we're doing it in a worshipful way for our Creator. And then scanning the scriptures, you can find a few other purposes for work, right? Those are kind of the foundation of why we work, because we reflect God in this world. But there's some other things that Scripture has a robust number of verses about work. And so here's just a couple things. And some of these we touched on. Work is important as a means to support yourself and your family, right? We have to support ourselves. Paul says in 2 Thessalonians 3:10, Paul famously says, if anyone is not willing to work, let him not eat, right? And he goes on to talk about, don't be a busybody, but be busy at work, providing for yourself and for your family, right? The Bible doesn't have a lot of patience for those who are able but unwilling to work to provide for themselves. Work is also a contribution to society. Somebody said that. Was it you? Points for you. Right? Work is a contribution to society. God created us in community. All people are interdependent on each other in this world. And as we work a job, we're contributing to the society and to the culture. And we, Christians, should do that better than anybody. Right? We should do it with the most purpose and the most gumption. Right? We should be doing our jobs better than anybody else because we're doing it for the glory of God. And we're doing it as a means of being good stewards of the creation. Martin Luther observed that, as an example, the Christian shoemaker doesn't do his duty by putting little crosses on all the shoes, right? But by making good shoes, because God is interested in good craftsmanship. That was Martin Luther, right? As we steward the creation, we should take care to do good work as we carry on the good work that God did in creation. Oh, and then there's a couple more. I thought I was at the end of the list here. Work is important as a means of being able to donate to or finance ministry, right? Whether that's supporting your own church, supporting another church's ministry, or financing, your own ability to do ministry if you're bivocational, right? Almost all forms of ministry need money. And the means in the New Testament that God laid out for funding the propagation of the gospel, for supporting the church, supporting pastors, is by God's people giving to those causes, right? And so we work as a means to support ministry. Paul talked about it in 1 Thessalonians 2:9. He worked to support his ministry, right? He says, we worked night and day that we might not be a burden to any of you as we proclaim the gospel to you. Paul viewed his work as a way to finance ministry. And then, perhaps most important, work is important as a mission field. Work itself is a ministry opportunity. Your job, well, I don't know where you're at right now, but most people are going to work most of their life, right? I know it's a sad thought, right? 40 hours a week for 40 years. Most people are going to work their entire life. Right? They're going to spend a lot of time there. Your job is the primary place for you to be a faithful witness to the world of who Jesus is. That's your job. That is the most effective way for the church to spread the gospel, is not by trying to get lost people into the church. We should do that. But the most effective way to spread the gospel is to take the people of the church and put them into every job and every vocation in our area and let them be a witness for the gospel. Your job is a mission field. And of course, like everything, maybe I already said that one. We work, we bring glory to God. Whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, says Paul, do it all to the glory of God. Okay? So that's the importance of work, right? And again, we were trying to paint this big picture perspective on work. Now we're going to talk about serving in the church. And then we'll kind of talk about the balancing part, the part that you came for. But let's talk about serving in the church for a minute. We're going to pivot to the other side of the scale, right? Let's consider serving in the church. If you go back to 2 Thessalonians 3, where I just read a minute ago, 2 Thessalonians 3:10, Paul said, if anyone's not willing to work, let him not eat. And he goes on to talk about, don't be a busybody, but be busy at work. Right after that little statement by Paul, right after that, in verse 13, Paul goes on to say, right from this thought, he says, brothers, also do not grow weary in doing good. Right? He says, hey, work so that you can eat, but also don't grow weary in doing good. He puts them both right there beside each other. He says, yes, work so you can earn a living, so you can contribute to society, et cetera, but also don't grow weary in doing good. Because here's the deal. We were made to work. We were also made to serve one another. We were made to serve one another. This is an innate purpose of why we are here. This is especially pronounced, more pronounced, I guess, in the New Testament. Once the church is established and God starts putting together this theology of the church, Paul goes into great detail about this in 1 Corinthians 12. Right? We're not going to get stuck here long because you probably know these teachings, right? 1 Corinthians chapter 12, Paul talks about the different spiritual gifts and how they come together in the church. He says, 2 Corinthians 12:4, now there are varieties of gifts, but the same Spirit. There are varieties of service, but the same Lord. And there are varieties of activities, but it's the same God who empowers them all in everyone. To each is given the manifestation of the Spirit for the common good. Right? And then Paul goes on to describe how God takes people with all these varieties of gifts and these varieties of services and these varieties of activities that you bring to the table, and he puts them together in a church to create a body. And he talks about how they need one another. Like everybody in the church needs one another, right? He compares it to an actual body, right? The toe needs the leg, and the leg needs the arm, and the eye needs the ear. And we all need one another in the church, right? We need each other. Peter also talks about this, 1 Peter 4:10. As each has received a gift, use it to serve one another as good stewards of God's very grace. As each has received a gift, use it to serve one another as good stewards of God's very grace. That's that word stewardship popping up again. Okay? I mentioned earlier that work is man's stewardship of God's creation. And now we see that service to one another is described as stewardship of the gifts that God has given us. Okay? You are meant to steward, be a good steward of who God made you to be, and use it for the purpose of serving others. Right? So if you're going to be a good steward of who God has made you to be, you're going to serve other people. And, as a pastor, I see people in the church who are not serving, not getting involved. They want to join the church and then just sit there. And I'm like, you're not being a good steward. God has gifted you uniquely. He's given you specific talents and abilities and gifts so that you can serve the body. And for anybody who's not doing that, the body's going to suffer, right? And so the question then is, knowing that that's true, how has God gifted you, right? Do you know the answer to that question? Do you know how God has uniquely gifted you to contribute to the church, to contribute to the church's mission? When was the last time that you knew or thought about what your spiritual gifts are? When was the last time you took a spiritual gifts test or did a shape profile that kind of tells you, all the things that are true about you and how they kind of connect to ministry, right? You should know the answer to that. How has God gifted me to serve in His church? And if you haven't done that recently, I'd encourage you to do that, right? And so I feel like I skipped something, but we'll just keep going. God has gifted every believer. Maybe that's what I was looking for. God has gifted everyone. There's no exception. Both Paul and Peter said everyone has received a gift for the purpose of serving, for the purpose of being a steward. So there's no exception, right? Everybody was given a gift, and they're to steward that for the common good and to serve the body of Christ. In fact, when we take people through the membership process at City View, and we're at the point, they've been through our whole process, we want to present them to the church for membership. We oftentimes read from these verses, and then I'll look at the members and I'll say, hey, if God has brought you here to be part of this body, it's because God knew in his wisdom that this church needs your unique giftedness to better be able to take the gospel to our city. He wouldn't have brought you here otherwise. You're part of the body. He brought you here with your unique giftedness to contribute to this church so we can better reach our city. And then I'll look at the church and I'll say, church, if we believe that God is calling them to be members of our church, then we should know that they are going to need you and your unique giftedness to support their ability to take the gospel to their city. Right? We need one another. This is how God designed it, to serve one another, to carry out the mission. All right. So you're like, okay, maybe you've heard all that before. So we're going to talk about balance, right? We want to bring it all together. God created us to work. God created us to serve. The question is, how do we do these things well, right? How do we do both of these things well? And so when it comes to balance, I'm going to touch on 5 things. Okay, 5 things, and then I got some practical tips for you at the end, right? I don't want you to walk away without and be like, so what do I do now with this information, right? I got some practical tips for you. I want to talk about 5 things real quick, and these are more up here, and then we'll kind of get real practical at the end. All right? Let me get a drink of water. Any comments or questions at this point? It's warm in here. Is that just me?
Yeah.
Whew.
It's definitely warmer in here than
Whew.
it is in the other rooms.
It's warmer now than it was earlier, so it must be, it's just radiating in here now. All right, that's right. We'll get through it. All right, so let's talk about balancing the two, right? I want to touch on, like I said, 5 things. Number 1, the importance of calling, okay? The importance of calling. So first, I want to validate the exact reason that we're having this conference, right? To try and help you understand what calling looks like for you right now. And before we can work out what balance looks like for you, you have to know what you're called to. And specifically, I have in mind specifically one of the big overarching questions of this conference. Are you called to full-time or bivocational ministry? Or are you called to lay ministry? Right? You have to kind of answer that question for yourself. How things are to be organized and balanced in your life depend first on that question, right? Because a full-time minister, their ministry is their job, right? And if you're a bivocational minister, that's probably the most difficult thing to navigate, even though it's becoming more and more common, because you likely have a job, but then being a pastor is also your job, right? Your ministry is your job, and so that can be difficult to navigate. But I want to make this point, okay? Some people are called to full-time or bivocational ministry, and everyone else is called to lay ministry. And I want you to see it as a calling, right? I know because I went through seminary, and for a long time I thought I was going to be a full-time pastor, right? And even years after seminary, I wrestled with, is God calling me to be a full-time pastor, right? And so I know I've asked myself these questions a lot of times. And then I finally came to a convictional place where I realized I'm going to serve my church in a pastoral role, but God's calling me to full-time work, right? But here's the point. A lot of times when you hear the word calling, you think, oh, that's for the guys that are going to be pastors, right? I don't want you to think about it that way, right? Everybody has a calling to ministry. You have a calling to ministry. You just have to ask yourself, am I called to full-time or bivocational ministry? You know, the guys that get paid and go to seminary and have degrees and those kind of things? Or am I called to regular ministry? Right? We call it lay ministry. That's not, not the most exciting word, but that's what it is. But the point is this, you're called to ministry. Whether it's full-time bivocational or it's lay ministry, you're called to that. And so it's important that you understand that, because if it's a calling, then you will align your life with that calling, right? If you're called to full-time ministry, you're going to align your life to that. You're going to go to seminary. You're going to raise support, maybe. You're going to, Do whatever you need to do to prepare yourself for full-time ministry, and it's your whole life aligns around that calling. Well, I would encourage everyone to align their life around their calling to ministry, and whether it's full-time ministry or lay ministry. And so before we can think about balance, I want you to think about that question first and be able to answer it. And maybe most of you know the answer, maybe you don't. Maybe God's unpacking that for you this weekend. I pray that that would be the case. But you have to start there, right? You have to start with calling. Number 2, talk about the importance of priorities, right? So we've got the question of calling, and we've got the importance of priorities, okay? If I were to ask you right now, what is the highest priority in your life? What would you say?
Should be Jesus.
Not a trick question. What did you say?
Should be Jesus.
Should be Jesus? Okay, very good. What about the second highest priority in your life? Okay, hearing some family stuff. What about the third? What about the fourth? What about the fifth? What about the sixth? It gets a little trickier, right? The further down that you go. And, you may have already picked up on this, okay? I'm like a type A person, all right? I like lists, organization, categorization. Like, this is just me. And so, if you're not a type A person, then this exercise, like the rigidness of it, may not mesh with you. But it's important to think about what our priorities are. Okay, and I will tell you, most people, even outside the church, even non-believers, right? Believers, it doesn't matter. Most people, if you were to ask them to list their top 5 or 6 priorities, most of them would be about the same for everybody. Now, where they are may differ, but most of them would be the same. So if we were to try and put that list together, let's say 6, right? If we were to try and put together, pretty much I'm telling you, everybody, they're pretty much the same. They may say them a little bit differently, but what do you think are the top 6 priorities in a person's life? Go, just shout them out. Family? Job? What else? Education, okay. Faith, sports, leisure, okay. Here they come. Rest, that's good. What? Stability, okay. Money, yep. You got to tie that to job, good. Okay, good. I think we hit on a lot of them, right? We've kind of put this list together. I'm going to categorize them into big groups, right? And really, for our purposes, we're going to focus on that of a believer. But I really don't think they differ that much for someone who's not a believer. But they're going to look something like this. God is probably, hopefully, first, right? Relationship with God, relationship with Christ. Religion is how maybe a worldly person would say it. You may say purpose, meaning, right? Why do we exist, right? For us, the answer is God. For somebody else, it may not be, right, if they don't believe in God. But God is probably top priority, right? Then there's family, right? And you can break that down into categories. Spouse, if you're married. Children, if you have children. Could be parents, grandparents, if you're still close with them or living with them or whatever. But family, right? Next tier is probably work/job/career/ if you're still in college, school, right? Or high school, whatever. So work, school, job, career, that kind of line, right? What do you do with your life, right? From a worldly perspective. And then church, right? Serving the church. For a believer, that's on the list. Church. Separate from my relationship with God, right? Personal relationship with God, my walk with Christ, however you want to say that. But then there's church, right? The world may say community or giving back or volunteering or society or whatever, right? For us, it's church. It's kind of our connection there to the world. And then leisure is how I would kind of categorize friendships, recreation, hobbies, leisure, right? And then probably on the list is health. I don't know if anybody said health, but rest, stability, mental health, right? That's the top priority for a lot of people. So good, right? This is a list that kind of encompasses everything, right? You can kind of lump everything into that category, one of those categories. So my point is this. We need to be able to take those priorities and say for ourselves how we would line them up. How would you create your list of priorities for you? Right? I would say we need to put that list together, okay? Because when it comes to balance, we won't even know if things are unbalanced unless we know how they should be ordered, right? We won't know when something's out of whack unless we know, it's God and then family and then job because I have to support my family and then church and then leisure and then when we know that that's what we want our priorities to be, then we can better perceive when they're misaligned. couple other key points on this. It's not going to be the same. Obviously, it's not the same for everybody, right? Depending on your stage of life, it's going to vary greatly, whether or not you're married, whether or not you have kids, whether or not you're in ministry or not, all those kinds of things. But it's also going to differ for you many times as you change your stage of life. As things change in your life, this is going to change for you. So, but let me tell you what it looks like for most people, right? Thinking about a believer. It's a relationship with God and Christ or Jesus first, right? That better be first, right? No need to elaborate on that, right? Relationship with God should be first. Then most likely it's family, right? And again, if you're younger, it's your parents or your siblings, your grandparents. As you get older, for most people, those things fall down the list, and it's your spouse and kids, right? How many of y'all are married? Anybody? Okay, about half. How many of y'all got kids? Okay, couple. What was that? What's this?
She's pregnant.
Okay. Good. He's like, I don't know.
I'm gonna be, but I'm not yet.
Okay, just checking. All right. Yes, for most people, as you get older, it's spouse and kids. And so for me, like it goes God, wife, kids, right? My other family members are important, but they're further down the list. It goes God, wife, kids. Here's the question. What's next? Is it work or church? Maybe it is, right? And so, is it work or church? First of all, you have to answer that calling question, right? But for most people, for most of us who don't work in ministry, work and career comes next, right? Because family is a priority. We need to support our family. And so we have to have a job or a career, right, to be able to support ourselves and support our family. And then church follows. And again, if you're in ministry, if you're bivocational, it gets a little muddied, right, because there's some overlap there. But for most people, if you're a volunteer at the church, if you're serving in ministry and things get busy at work, right, you're probably not going to quit your job to be able to serve as a volunteer in church, right? So job typically is going to be that next thing. But again, it depends on you and your situation. And this is where balance comes in, right? And by the way, it's nice to have some time left over for friends and leisure and rest and all those other kinds of things. It doesn't always work out that way, right? Sometimes those things get squeezed out. But, the important thing is that you should prioritize these things. And we're going to kind of circle back to this in a minute. So number 3, consider the importance of boundaries, right? Priorities and then boundaries, right? If you know your calling and you understand your priorities, then the next thing to consider is how to set boundaries in certain areas of your life in order to protect your list of priorities, right? So if our highest priorities are our walk with the Lord and our family, those are non-negotiable. So a wise person will put boundaries in place everywhere else in their life to protect those things, right? We don't want our work to consume us to the point that we don't have time for our family. We don't want to sign up for so many things at church that we don't have time for a personal devotion with the Lord. We don't want to cram our calendar so full of commitments that we never have time for health and rest, right? We need boundaries. We need healthy boundaries. And work and church are no exception to that, right? So when it comes to work, some of us have more control over our work than others. But ideally, you have some boundaries in place at work, right? It's important to know, what does my job expect of me, right? You need to have some clear-cut boundaries. It's, sometimes you have, again, it depends on the job. You have a rotating schedule, whatever, but some clear-cut, this is what's expected of me. X number of hours, I get this much time off. It's something that's kind of agreed upon. So that when those boundaries get pushed, you can point back to your agreement and the expectations and say, hey, wait a minute. I have some boundaries in place. I got some other things in my life that I'm trying to manage, and I need some boundaries at work. Or maybe you're, young and not married, don't have a family to support, and you got student loan debt coming out your ears, and you want to work as much as possible, right? Because you're in that season of life where you can just work to try and pay down your debt or whatever. So it may look different for you, right? That's why it's important to know the priorities. But in most cases, you need to set some boundaries. And that's true for work, and it's true for the church, right? If you find yourself making so many commitments at church that it's impacting your ability to work, then maybe you need some more boundaries when it comes to serving the church. Any of you guys like a yes man? You have that problem? Like you get asked to do something, you're like, yep, I'll do it. Because you don't want to let, you don't want to perceive like you're letting people down. Yeah, so it's hard, right? Sometimes you got to set some boundaries as to the number of commitments that you can have so you can keep things balanced. So we got to think about boundaries. And again, we're going to tie all this together here in a minute. But number 4, consider also the importance of flexibility. Having flexibility is super important. depending on your season of life, your priorities will change over time. And so the boundaries that you put in place also have to be able to change. We have to regularly evaluate the balance in our lives and make the necessary adjustments when needed, right? Because things change. You get married. You change jobs. You change churches. You start a new ministry. You get fired. Your spouse changes jobs. Somebody passes away. You have a child. You have a second child. You have a third child. 4 children, right? Things change, right? My life is totally different now than it was 4 years ago, right? And so you have to be able to make adjustments. You have to be able to be flexible in your life. You have to be willing to seek the Lord and make changes, right? And something that's important with this, we need to have open lines of communication with our family, with our church, with our work, to be able to say, am I slipping here? Or am I neglecting my family? Am I neglecting my job? Am I doing too much? Am I neglecting rest? So you got to have people in your life that know you, that you trust, that can speak that into your life. So that's important. Having boundaries, and then having flexibility. And then lastly, just to kind of round out the list, remember the importance of grace, right? Importance of grace for yourself in this, right? Balancing is hard. And we're going to screw this up. Right? I'm going to let my family down. I have done it many times. I'm going to let my church down. So it's important to remember grace, right? Some of my favorite verses in the Bible are from 2 Corinthians chapter 12. Now, Paul, in a difficult season, says, "But he said to me," meaning God, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly in my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me." So just, a reminder as we get towards the end of this thing to remember grace, right? Balancing things is hard. We're going to screw it up. It's important to remember we have the tendency to allow things to get unbalanced. It just happens, right? We have the tendency to prioritize the wrong things and to commit to too many things and to let things get out of whack. And so we have to expect to course correct. That's why the flexibility thing is so important. So let's get to the practical part, right? Practical tips here for putting this all together, right? We want to do our work for the glory of God to the best of our ability. We want to serve our church, being good stewards of our gifts, and we want to try and balance all this stuff together. So here's some practical tips. First of all, and some of this is just tying it together, I would encourage you to actually make a list of priorities, to actually write it down, right? If you had to write out your top 6 priorities in your life right now, what would they be? If you don't know, I would encourage you that you should, right? And then, after you write them down, I would go to somebody that you trust in your life that knows you well and say, hey, look, I'm trying to order some things in my life. I just wrote down that these are the top priorities in my life. Would you agree with that? Do I live like this is true? And ask someone to kind of speak into that after you make that list to validate that you actually did put it down the way that you intended to. And then you should regularly remind yourself of these things. It's so easy to get things out of perspective and to forget the most important things. And I just want to say this here. Because if you're a believer, then your relationship with God and your walk with your Heavenly Father better be first, right? Amongst all the other things that we're talking about today, make sure that your relationship with God is always first. There's many times where I've caught myself and have to remind myself that God wouldn't give me so many responsibilities that I didn't have time to spend with Him. Okay? Whether it's work, whether it's church, whether it's family, right? There are people that idolize family. Just if you're building your list of priorities, make sure God's at the top. And just remember, God wouldn't give me so many important. I'm not so important with so many things to do that I shouldn't have time to spend with the Father. Right? Jesus, the most important man who ever lived, oftentimes, daily, walked away from his ministry, walked away from his disciples, walked away from all the people that needed him to be with the Father. Right? So when you make that list, always remember to prioritize time with the Lord. And then order the rest of your priorities after that. And then second, this is important. I don't think I've talked about this yet. Understand your purpose within each priority. I would encourage you to understand your purpose within each priority. Okay, for each of the things on that list, why is that thing a priority? Could you write a purpose statement for that thing? right? So, for example, my wife is a priority, right? You're like, yeah, I would hope so. My wife is a priority. I said that for the camera, just in case she watches, right? My wife's a priority, but in what way? Why? Why is my wife a priority? You're like, that's an obvious question. But here's the thing. I want to know what the why is, because I need to know what the why is when I need to remind myself. I had that backwards. I want to be able to remind myself what the why is when I'm failing to prioritize my wife as I should. Right? When I start to get things out of whack, I need to be able to say, what was the reason that this is a priority in my life? And be able to point back to that so that I can make that my focus, right? Why is my wife a priority? Seems like a silly question, but sometimes we need to be reminded of silly things, right? So here's what it might sound like. And you're like, wait, you mean really write out a purpose statement? Yeah, really write out a purpose statement. Here's what it might sound like for my wife. I'm committed to loving my wife as Christ loves the church, laying my life down for her, providing for her, and protecting her. Those are all biblical concepts. And leading her spiritually for the glory of God. Right? That validates the reason that my wife is number 2 on my list. And when things get busy, and I get too committed to the church or too busy at my job, and I need to be reminded why balance is so important, I can look at that purpose statement. This is what I committed to do for my wife. This is who I want to be for my wife. What about as being a father? Right? What's my purpose for being a father? Why should my kids be a priority in my life? Right? I'm committed to providing for them and protecting them, but it's more than that, right? I want to leave a legacy of faith. I want my kids to know the Lord. I want to raise them up as men who contribute to society, but as men who worship God and live on mission, right? That requires a different level of commitment to being a father, right? It's not just that I need time with my kids because I like being with my kids, right? I need intentional time with my kids to be able to disciple them. So write a purpose for that, right? And then work, right? What is my purpose at work? Why is it a priority? Is it just a job? Is it a career? Is it a calling? What is your purpose at work? Is your job your mission field? Are you doing it for the glory of God? Right? This is important. You gotta answer the why. I read a story, a little anecdote about a guy who walked into a large building in the city. Right? It's under construction. And so he walks into the building and he encounters 3 stonemasons as he's walking through. And he comes to the first stonemason and he goes, "Hey, what are you doing?" And the guy goes, "I'm laying stone." And so he keeps walking. And he comes out to the second stonemason. He says, "Hey, what are you doing?" And the guy goes, "I'm making a living." And he keeps walking and goes to the third stonemason. "Hey, buddy, what are you doing?" The guy goes, "I'm building a cathedral where people are going to worship God." 3 guys all doing the exact same thing. Same job, same task, 3 totally different perspectives, right? Perspective is important. Purpose in what you're doing is important. So I'd encourage you to write down, what is your purpose for going to work every day? Is it just to make money? Or is there more there, right? What is your purpose at church? Why is church a priority to you, right? It's not just that, why do you need the church, right? Why isn't it just, hey, I'm saved, I got God, it's just me and God, me and Jesus, we're good. Why do you need the church? Why are you committed to serving the church? Write it out, right? Write out a purpose statement for what your relationship with the church is. How has God uniquely gifted and designed you to serve His church, and why? And write it down. And then third, again, tying these things together, evaluate your life, your work life, and your church life regularly for possible imbalance. Evaluate often. I love evaluating, whether it's what I'm doing at work. I love to evaluate things that we've done at church, ministries, and that kind of thing. And I love to self-evaluate, to self-reflect. And this is so important, right? To evaluate your work life and your church life for possible imbalance. And if you haven't done those first few steps, it can be hard, right? It just gives you a direction. If I know these are my priorities, this is my calling, this is what I'm trying to do, then it helps you to honestly evaluate. And like I said, we're really not good at this personally. It's better to allow others to speak into your life, to go to someone that you trust and say, "Hey, where do you think in my life I might be unbalanced?" So a couple more. Number 4, I would encourage you to, we kind of joked about this earlier, but really plan rest and recreation into your schedule. Maybe not so much recreation, but rest. Plan these things into your schedule, right? Hope you know the importance of rest, right? I think a lot of people that get squeezed out, we want to do, right? I want to do my job. I want to serve the church. I want to go, and do. We need to remember to plan rest into our schedule. Rest is so important that God made it a point to model rest for us, right? God didn't need to rest after he created, but he did that to set an example, to create a model for us, because I think he knew that we'd be stubborn and we needed that example. And we'd say to ourselves, well, if God rested, I guess I should rest too, right? It's important that we schedule rest into our schedules. And then, similar to that, but different, plan margin into your schedule. You're like, isn't that the same thing? It's not the same thing, right? Similar, but it's different. Rather than, planning rest is making sure that you're taking a day off from doing stuff, right? We don't have a Sabbath rest written into the law like the Jews did, but plan a day off, plan a vacation. That's planning rest. Planning margin is leaving room in your schedule on a daily basis for the unexpected to happen, right? You can't plan everything out. I'm a planner. Like I said, I'm type A. When I was in seminary, I was like full load of classes. I had 3 jobs. I had all this stuff. I would take my weekly planner and I would fill in every hour and minute of the day with, here's when I'm going to do this, here's when I'm going to do that. I would schedule when I would shower, when I would eat, to fit it in, right? There was no margin in my schedule. And it's just not wise to do that because unexpected things happen, right? So plan margin into your life, into your schedule. I went into this week with an idea of what I needed to accomplish this week and when I was going to do it. But what I didn't plan for was I was going to have 2 sick kids this week, and I got a curveball thrown at me at work, and then I've got a guy in our church that we had to minister to. I had to meet with him 3 times this week because of something that he's dealing with in his life. I didn't plan any of that. And so if I didn't have margin in my schedule, it would have forced me into a situation where things got way out of whack, right? Because I didn't have room for things to be added in into my schedule. And so plan margin into your schedule. All right, here's another important concept related to that. Another tip. This is from experience. Like I said, I've struggled with this over the years. So I would encourage you to know where your pressure release valves are. Okay? And I'll explain what I mean by that. But know where your pressure release valves are. And this just speaks to the idea of what can you control or what can you adjust when pressure is too high in one area of your life, right? Do you have the ability to release some pressure if life gets out of whack, right? So for example, at work, do you have a way to release pressure when work is getting to be so much that it's crowding out other things in your life, like serving in the church, right? Do you have a good line of communication with your boss? Do you have an understanding of what the expectations of you are in your job, right? How hard would it be for you to leave work early or to switch schedules if something came up in your life? Is there any flexibility? Have you clearly defined the parameters of your job and what can you do if something has to be adjusted, right? And every job is going to be totally different on that, right? I don't know what it would look like for you. For me, like for my boss, he's just a regular old boss. He's not a believer, but my boss knows me. He knows about my wife. He knows about my kids. He knows I'm a pastor at my church. He knows about my responsibilities outside of work. And he knows those things because I've built a relationship with him. And because I'm good at my job, right? I do my job to the best of my ability. And so he respects that and I have a reputation there. But, I've built a relationship with my boss and he knows my reputation. And so that benefits me, right? Because of those things, if something happens in my life to where pressure is building and I need to adjust at work, he's the kind of guy that would let me leave early on any given day if something came up in my life. I also have, if that's done enough pressure release, I also know I've demonstrated that I have the ability, I can work from home if I need to be home with my family. And I know if pressure is really mounted and I had to, my boss would let me have off if I needed to, right? Because I've built that relationship with him. And again, it's going to be totally different in every job, but what are some things that you can do to release some pressure? And you can say the same thing about church, right? What if it's church that's got so busy, you've got committed to so many things that it's impacting your work or it's impacting your family, right? That's what we're talking about here. What are some pressure release valves for church, right? Same kind of a thing. Do you have an open line of communication with somebody? Can you talk to your pastor? Can you talk to a ministry leader and say, hey, this has become too much for me? Is there a pipeline or a team of people that you're volunteering with, or somebody else could step in and take your role? So that's what I mean. Pressure release valves, right? What are some outs that you can have in case something comes up and needs to be adjusted? Right? That's that flexibility that I talked about earlier. And I don't know what that looks like for you, but you should ask yourself those questions, right? And ideally, you think about those things before the pressure arises, right? I don't know what your job looks like, but if something were to happen that would impact your ability to go to work, would you get fired? Or do you have a way to flex and adjust and those kind of things? And the same thing you could ask about church. From a ministry perspective, this is why a team model in church is so important, right? In our church, we have 10 ministry teams, and I would never want a ministry to have just one person in it, right? That's too much of a load to carry. I like to have a ministry leader and a backup leader and multiple church members on that team outside of them so they share the responsibility. And it's good for discipleship and team building and all those kind of things. But if one person has to adjust the way that they're serving, there's other people that can kind of step in and carry out that task to completion. It's the same reason we have an elder team at our church, right? I really struggle with the churches that just have one pastor who does everything, right? There's no pressure release valve for him. He's got to do everything. He's got to carry everything. For y'all's church and our church to have a plurality of leadership to where if I can't do what I've committed to do, somebody else can step in and do that. And we should have the flexibility and the ability to do that. All right, 2 more. And I'll get these out real quick so we can be done on time. But 2 more things I would tell you. In the midst of all this conversation, don't be afraid or ashamed to say no to something, right? To not commit to something. I know some of y'all raise your hand and say, yeah, I'm kind of a yes man. I tend to do that. All right, don't be afraid to say no to something, right? Think about when an opportunity presents itself to you. Think about your priorities. Think about your calling. And then think about what this is. Do you have any margin in your life? If you don't, if you're already struggling, if you're already unbalanced, don't be afraid to say no. But then the flip side of that, to muddy it up, don't neglect saying yes, right? Don't always neglect saying yes. And again, I'm thinking more about the church. In most people's cases, you don't have an opportunity to say no at work, right? You have to say yes to whatever they ask you to do most of the time. But at church, at church, opportunities present themselves, and if there's a lot of pressure in your life and a lot of unbalance in your life, and you're wrestling with things, have the freedom to say no. You're not indispensable. But if you're not serving, or you feel like you may have the freedom to serve, I would just encourage you to have the freedom to say yes too, if you think you have room for an opportunity in the church in your schedule. And then to put a bow on it all. As a final thought, as a practical tip, always walk with the Lord above everything else and trust His Spirit to guide you in every decision, right? And walk with the Lord above all else and trust His Spirit to guide you in every decision, right? Whatever you're dealing with, bathe it in prayer, walk with the Lord, ask Him to guide you, and He will. One of my favorite preachers, the late Tim Keller, said, finding balance between work and church service is not about fitting God into your schedule, but centering your entire life around Him. Make every aspect of your life, including your work, an act of worship. Like I said, one of my favorite preachers, and a great thought there. It's not about fitting God into your schedule, right? When it comes to balancing work and serving in the church, it's like, how can I fit something else in? It's about starting with God, knowing what your other priorities in your life are, and then aligning everything with those priorities. And so I didn't leave a lot of time for questions, and so I'm sorry about that. But any comments or questions on some of this stuff? Again, so I kind of spoke in generalities because everybody's situation is different. So, I don't know if anybody has a question pertaining to your specific situation or anything like that. You guys are just happy to be here. Okay.
What about if you're trying to balance school, a job, and ministry?
It's just another layer. You have to, like I said, it's important for me. And again,
especially if the school is feeding into the
right.
ministry.
Like I said, part of it's my personality, but for me, it's all about knowing which is which, right? And like you said, they're all interconnected. But if something were to happen that would eliminate one of those, which one would it be? And then if something were to happen that we're going to eliminate one of the next one, what would it be? You know what I mean? So you have to know if you're going to school for a certain job or for a certain ministry, my thought would be that you have to complete that and able to move on to the next thing. And so, obviously you have to be able to support yourself. You have to take that into consideration. But in my mind, based on just, not knowing the whole context of your question, it's like I gotta get this school done so that I can have the job, so that I can do the ministry. But you have to decide that. You have to pray, seek the Lord, and say, God, what's the order here, right? And obviously you want to try and work all three into your life, but which one takes the most priority? And then how do you kind of balance everything after that? So for me, that's what it always goes back to. It's God first, and this is my family. Like, those are non-negotiable. Like, I would walk away from my job if it was going to be a detriment to my family if I had to. You know what I mean? You would change jobs. You would change schools. You would, hopefully the church isn't a detriment to you, but you have to know the priorities, right? So, I don't know. That's what I would say. I don't know if that's helpful.
Also seek guidance as well.
That's an excellent, yes, absolutely. Like I said, our view of ourselves is often kind of muddied, right? Whether for better or for worse. So it's always good to have someone, that knows you, kind of help you through that. So, good comment. Thank you. Anybody else? Okay.
How do you? So in your own life, how have you dealt with burnout as a father of 4 boys and lay minister and work in a management position at UPS? I'm sure you've experienced burnout before. So how do you deal with that?
Yep, absolutely.
And prevent it, ideally.
Ideally, yeah, prevent it. But it is good to think about how you deal with it as well, because it often happens and comes up. So yeah, it's a good question, and it's a reality. And that's why, like I said, when I was talking about like the pressure release valves and all this stuff, it's good to, while you're able to, kind of prepare ahead of time to be able to make adjustments if needed, right? And so we're usually not that wise though, right? We got to kind of go through a failure, and then we okay, yeah, I need to be more careful and we're prepared next time. So, but yeah, burnout's a real thing. And like I said, it's helpful to know what the non-negotiables are, right? Usually burnout happens when you're doing so much that you've neglected your relationship with the Lord, right? I know that's when burnout happens for me. Because to be honest, if we're prioritizing God and prioritizing family, and we're saying, I'm going to protect these against everything else, it's hard to get to that burnout phase. Because I'm going to drop something else. I'm going to walk away from a ministry. I'm going to give away a responsibility. I'm going to back off of a commitment. If I thought, this is kind of a silly example, but like being here today to speak was going to be a huge detriment to my family, I'd have called Autumn up and be like, hey, look, I'm not going to let this kill my family or whatever. So we have to, have those priorities. And oftentimes when we get burnout, it's because we've neglected that. And so we have to get back to, for me, it's always, I got to get right with the Lord. And so I may have to set some things aside and have a season of prayer, a season of, fasting, getting counsel, saying, hey, I've got some things out of whack. Can you help me put it back together? And usually, for me, my personal experience, not everybody, is I got to go back and work on my relationship with God. And then I got to make sure my wife's okay, right? Because usually if I'm burned out, it's affected her. And so we got to work through some things, and I can start to put the pieces back in order. But that doesn't mean, if I'm burned out, I can quit my job, right? I can't do that. So it's like, okay, hey, elders, I'm going through a season. I need to step away. And hopefully you have the ability to do that, right? And kind of set some things aside for a little bit. Friendships, whatever it is, to focus on what's most important and put your life back together. So, but yeah, ideally, you learn from that and put some boundaries in place, right? Like I said, if I know I'm so busy at church that I'm just kind of giving God my leftovers every day, I'm too busy, right? I need to be able to prioritize my walk with the Lord. I need to be able to give my family the time they deserve. And if I'm not able to do those things, I'm approaching burnout. Because I'm going to get burned out when I fail to do what I know I should be doing. Does that make sense? Good question.
Yeah, that's usually what fuels burnout, is doing too much of things you don't really need to be doing and not enough of the things you need to be doing.
Exactly. Great question. All right. Well, it's 4:00, so I don't know. if they're gonna start on time. I don't want you guys to miss the session. So I'm so grateful that you guys sat in here with me. Hopefully it was helpful. I'll
It won't start without us.
you like lead worship or something? They can't start without us. Thank you guys for being here. I appreciate you guys. It was good.
See a water bottle in here. Brown water bottle.
Yeah, it's right here.
Hey.